Michael.
I'll use this as a chance to segue to a topic that I want to get into, but the segue is from Challipan and Covent Garden because I have some information about recording. But in the last year, there has been disclosure of the existence of masters that both Victor in the United States and EMI, or at that point Gramophone Company in England, were recording simultaneous two masters using two different microphones with the result of stereo recordings. And last May, there was a broadcast about it on NPR, and some unnamed RCA source was quoted as saying that there was no commercial interest in this. Well, in the past year, there has been very little of discussion of things that would be of more interest to collectors than these recordings. One note that I have here from Bill Moran is that the July 4th, 1928 Covent Garden Challipan concert is one of these that was recorded in stereo. He discovered that about 10 years ago. The only way we will be able to get these things, except for the occasional sides that both the 1 and 1A, or in the case of the Ellington issues, the SHQ and the RC versions of those records both were accidentally either released or came out with a test pressing that got into private hands. The only way we will be able to get these things, except for these occasional snippets, would be for you people to go and check in both this country and in England your vaults and see what safety parts might be there and do some checking on these. Is there going to be some work that will investigate on these masters?
Who goes first?
Speaking for EMI in Europe, I can tell you that there is no truth whatever in this Californian idea that 1 and 1A were made from different microphones. And I have the authority for saying this from he asked me not to mention his name, from the engineer who was making these records right from the early 20s until he retired in the 60s, and was in fact the engineer for the very first recordings ever made at Abbey Road. Two machines were used, when they were used, which wasn't always, purely to save time and artists' exhaustion. Indeed, there's a letter from Geisberg to Elgar, for example, saying, we have arranged to have two machines for you in order that you should not get too tired. Both these machines, when making commercial records, were fed from precisely the same microphone mix. And if people see two microphones in a photograph, they should not assume that they are both independent and producing a different signal for a different recording machine. In fact, we nearly always used 4 microphones for all big sessions, including Covent Garden. The inputs from these microphones were mixed and fed to 1 or 2 or even sometimes 3 machines. If there are differences to be perceived occasionally between 1 and 1A, I can only account for it in differences in the characteristics of the cutting head, or unevennesses in the waxes, or whatever.
In the case of the Duke Ellington that was issued, one was recorded with a LBRC prefix, and the other was recorded with an LBSHQ prefix. By definition, completely different equipment had to be used in order to have those two different prefixes.
Well, I spoke.
From microphone to cutter.
I spoke for EMI only.
Yeah, but the chain is completely separate because the RC, SHQ, and HQ prefixes mean particular pieces of equipment for royalty payments.
I've had this on my desk since the article was published November of '85, and I've not done any follow-up on it. I want to back up a little here so we can get an overview of how do we accomplish these steps that have been proposed to the various record companies, and I speak for RCA Records. About 1.5% of our employee roster, which involves about 3,000 employees, works with recordings. That does not include the engineers. I'm speaking of artist and repertoire staff. And over the years, the A&R department of RCA has diminished. It's a very small staff. There's a small commercial operation, and there's a small Red Seal operation, and there's a small special products A&R staff. And it's a rather small group supporting this huge framework. This was discussed last week at RCA Records, and some of the producers said they were not interested in it. I did tell my producing staff that if they wanted to, because we have an obligation to our clients, because we produce on contract, to give them the best quality possible, that I gave them the authority to pull out the 1 and the 1As and begin to work with them in the studio. So if there's a 1 and a 1A on Glenn Miller Moonlight Serenade, let's see what it's going to sound like. Or we're predominantly dealing in popular repertoire. And so that's my thinking. I'm willing to invest some time and some money to find out what does it sound like.
I don't think you'll find it much after around 33 or 34.
Okay. Well, we're releasing a lot of repertoire in the teens and 20s these days. I think maybe that the Ellington recordings, without having researched it, may have been experimental projects. May have been. I don't know. I have to research it.
I think they were just trying to see which...
But the 1 and the 1, yeah, but when you get to the standard 1 and 1A, I just think that's just going to give the illusion of a different kind of a sound because of a phasing change between the 1 and the 1A. So we'll do our homework and see.